Thank you again for joining me. My name is Dante DiMatteo with the Ask the Pharmacist group. So, in this discussion, I wanted to shed light on a question that I received from a friend, somebody that I run into from time to time. The gist of the question was, and I tried to clean it up a little bit, I'm concerned with aches, pains, and inflammation, and also the monetary costs associated with eating a meat-heavy diet. I'm thinking about switching to a plant-based diet, or at least drastically limiting my intake of animal protein. I also struggle to get enough protein in on a daily basis. What are your thoughts? So obviously there's just a lot to unpack there. So my approach may not be 100% perfect, but I'm going to at least shed light on kind of how I would decipher some of this and, best answer his question. Firstly, unless there is an established food allergy or intolerance, I would hesitate to make any drastic or restrictive changes to your current eating habits. So just to make it clear, there's absolutely nothing wrong with switching to a vegan or vegetarian style diet. There's favorable outcomes across the board throughout the research when compared to more all-inclusive diets in the health context and also in the context of strength, muscle hypertrophy, and performance. So, irregardless of the diet you choose to pursue, we still believe the following criteria must be met from a health perspective. So, firstly, we want to acknowledge that the total caloric needs of the individual are being met. So, for this particular individual, is he in a position where he's trying to gain weight, lose weight, maintain his weight? We're operating under the assumption that he's taken a waist circumference to kind of see maybe where he sits from a perspective of kind of which direction he should go. Also, we want to make sure we're again reaching adequate protein intake. And so numbers wise, in previous discussions, we talked about shooting for like 1 gram or so per pound of body weight of protein. So this is just a range. This isn't a definite. It's just a hard and fast number for you to kind of easily remember. The other side of the protein intake portion of this is that mainly from conversations that I've had, sometimes it's tough to get kind of bang for your buck protein quantity per serving. So if you are still eating meat, you'll notice that sometimes per 3 ounces or per 4 ounces of meat that you're getting a little more protein. So that means that if you do switch over to a more plant-based camp, that's more soy-based products, that's more edamame, that's a little more tofu, unless you're getting like a high protein form. Again, this isn't 100%, but from what I can tell, it's generally just a little bit harder. Again, if you're comparing this to somebody who's coming from an animal-based diet. So next, we want to ensure that you are hitting adequate fiber intake. And so that's like 30 plus grams a day. And this is where something like a plant-based approach would really help, because most of the good fiber that we're looking for can be found in those plant sources and vegetables. And then finally, we want to make sure we limit our saturated fat intake to less than 10% of our total calories per day. And so somebody who eats predominantly red meat, or they eat predominantly a animal-based diet, notice that this can be a bit more challenging because of kind of the macronutrient breakdown of those, meat food items. So the next part of the question that I wanted to unpack a bit is the portion regarding pain and inflammation. So pain is a incredibly complex phenomenon of psychological and physiological components. So I think that sometimes when we're discussing an area that hurts, or we have an injury, or we do have some aches and pains, we become a little bit too reductionist, and we try to find that one piece or that one problem that's causing, said pain experience. And so in this case, if he does switch up his diet a little bit, maybe he does feel a little better, or his knees feel a little better. That's certainly a possibility, but with anything, I'm not jumping to a singular answer to, address his concern. Specifically with inflammation, we obviously know there's a good side and a bad side. The good side of inflammation is a complex response of how our body responds to an injury, an incidence of trauma, or illness, in which we need that inflammation to help us heal. So the flip side, we're looking at chronic inflammation, and this is reflective of things like cardiometabolic disease, Alzheimer's disease, and, many cancers. And similar to pain, this is also something that I'm not like encouraging somebody to preemptively worry about, especially if you're focused more on the 4 or 5 principles that we mentioned kind of at the start. And so this allows you to focus on the things that you can control. And so if you're looking to maintain a healthy weight, if you are at a healthy weight, you're at a much lower chance of experiencing, these incidences of chronic inflammation. Next, inflammation is something that I'm typically not preemptively worrying about or encouraging somebody to worry about. Reason being, I feel that the couple of points that we mentioned more at the start of this video, monitoring your total caloric intake, ensuring that it keeps you at a healthy weight, following those sorts of things ensures that you're in a good position to keep chronic inflammation down. So it's not that you're not worrying about it, but again, you're focusing on the actionable parts of this that can help prevent these issues that can occur down the line. And finally, if we look at the inflammatory index of foods, where if we look at a sort of a more all-inclusive diet versus a plant-based diet, you're going to see items that intersect. And so on both sides of the spectrum, there's the chance that you're going to be eating some semblance of an inflammatory food. So just something to consider. Next, he mentioned that he was having trouble increasing his protein intake. And so as I mentioned, switching to a plant-based diet, I'm not so sure is the easiest way to increase your protein intake because it can be a little bit more challenging inherently just because of the differences in serving sizes. So addressing somebody's inability to hit their protein goals is obviously very individualized. There's many barriers and factors to addressing that. And so with him specifically, I don't have all of that info. Dietary preferences in general make a huge difference when trying to, surpass that barrier. Our likes and dislikes and such make a huge difference. Even though we advocate for mostly whole food sources of protein, this is an instance where protein powders can really bridge the gap. So if he's having trouble, this is where, regardless of what diet he follows, we can recommend our whey protein isolate, or you can even do our vegan plant-based product, which is an easy way to get 20 to 30 extra grams or more a day if you're having trouble hitting your numbers. And then finally, the cost part of this. And so this is a very tricky subject. So before comparing the cost differences between the two different diets, the necessary starting point would just be to make it very clear that the commitment of eating healthy is inherently more expensive than the alternative. So you're already operating on the premise that you're going to be spending a little more money than you would if you're eating fast foods and processed foods and all things of that nature. And so to take that a step further, there was a recent study that showed that healthier diets, quote unquote, are upwards of $1.50 a day more expensive than the less healthy, more heavily processed alternatives. And then there's also showing that there's other data showing that the heavily animal-based diets do have the potential to cost a little bit more money, depending on what kind of meat you're selecting, the volume, if you're buying it, pre-cut, cut, ground, all those sort of things make a difference. So I'll hedge my bet and say maybe you do spend a few more dollars over the long term on an animal-based diet, but who's to say? So if cost is a bigger priority for you, maybe it's not the worst thing to try a plant-based diet. But again, we're operating under the premise that making a commitment to eat healthier can inherently be more expensive anyway. Unfortunately, I do not have a hot take or a remarkable closing statement for this individual, but simply you just got to do your best to meet the criteria that we've defined at the start of this video and also in other discussions. And if a more all-inclusive diet or a plant-based diet is what's going to help you stay adherent and meet those goals, then I encourage you to, choose the path that works best for you. Thanks. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this video, we would appreciate it very much if you would subscribe and hit the bell below. Thanks.